Okay, so here we are. We've got this engine. We know cooling system looks good. Engine oil looks relatively good. No indications of any kind of a problem. We need to do a compression test. We're not going to tune this car up yet because unless we have compression, good compression in each cylinder, that's the heart of the engine, you might just as well forget it. You can throw all the tune-up parts on it that you want. It's not going to make any difference. You've got to have internal compression. It was built with probably 8.5 to 1 or 8 to 1 compression. You've got to do a compression test on it, and that way you'll know the inside, the cylinders, pistons, piston rings, head gaskets, valves, intake and exhaust valves are all in either good condition, or we might find something that's worn. So the first thing we want to do is take off the air cleaner. We want to block open the choke. We want to block open the throttle valve in the carburetor because we're going to be doing a compression test. We want to suck in as much air as possible into these cylinders. We're going to ground out the coil. So as we're cranking this, we don't want any sparks or anything like this. And the whole thing is we are going to do a compression test. Before we get to that, we're going to take out every spark plug. And by taking out the spark plugs, we're going to look at each spark plug individually, and that spark plug is right there in the middle of everything that's going on in that engine. If there's something wrong, it's going to show up on a spark plug. And basically, we take out a spark plug and we look at it. Say this is out of number 1 cylinder. We're looking at, is the plug dirty? Is it black? Is it white? Is it covered with carbon deposits? Is it covered with oil deposits? If it's very dark and caked up with oil deposits, you'll actually feel it. It'll be oily. That will be an indication that the piston rings or the cylinder walls or valve seals are leaking oil into the engine. You might have noticed that if it's got this problem by oil smoke coming out the tailpipe. Okay, so if this spark plug is black with a sooty carbon type thing, it means the engine, that particular cylinder, is running rich. And that could be carburetor running rich. Might be a miss. Maybe the plug wire is bad, maybe the plug is bad, but it's not firing, or it's firing in a very rich mixture. Ideal mixture for this engine is about 15 to 1, 15 parts air to 1 part gasoline. But with these older engines, as I said before, with the chokes, they're running rich a lot of the time, particularly in the wintertime. So it's not uncommon to pull plugs out in an older engine like this and they'll be covered with soot, a black sooty deposit. A plug that's in there for a while and is burning, it should be a little discolored, maybe brown, a little white tinge to it. There could be some minor deposits on there, but that indicates that's just byproducts of combustion. But your plugs are going to tell you what's happening in each one of those cylinders. If you pull a spark plug out and it is perfect, it is white as can be, it looks like it's brand new, that could be an indication of another problem, meaning that there's a little bit of coolant or antifreeze leaking into that cylinder, and believe it or not, this spark plug is actually getting steam cleaned every time it fires. So you don't want them too clean. I mean, you can take them out of a cylinder that's had a coolant leak, and they will look absolutely perfectly brand new, and that's no good either. So this plug is going to tell you whether you've got oil leakage into the cylinder, whether you've got a rich mixture, too much gasoline, or if it's running right, or if you've got possibly a coolant leak. These will tell you exactly what's going on in each one of those cylinders. And as you take them out of the engine, lay them out in order. Get a piece of paper if you want, lay them out in order so you know this plug came out of this particular cylinder. And when you lay them all out, we have 6 of them laid here, you can see, are they all the same? Is one darker than the other? Is one lighter than the other? You can get an indication on how those cylinders are firing just by looking at the spark plugs. So that being said, we've taken them all out. We see really nothing major there. So now what we're going to do, we're going to do that compression test. What you need to do is get yourself a good compression gauge, like this here. And these will screw into the, there's an adapter here, you can actually screw it right into the spark plug hole. And it will give you the reading of the compression ratio. And what we are looking for, if you look in the manual, let's just say for discussion purposes, each cylinder should put out 130 pounds compression. So we're going to look at that and see what happens when we crank this engine, how much compression is in each one of those cylinders. What we're going to do now, as I said before, the air cleaner is off, the carburetor is completely open, your coil wire is grounded. You can do this by yourself with a remote starter switch like this, hooked up between the starter solenoid and the starter and the battery, or you can have someone go in and actually crank the engine with the key. So the idea is you've got all these things in there, you screw in your compression gauge and you crank the engine over until you get the highest reading. Okay, so if we were cranking this now, maybe 8, 9 times it would crank over and the needle would come up, and on this gauge it'll stay there. Okay, you've got a release here on it, but it will stay there. So you can look at it, get your pencil out, your paper, and record the reading. So let's just say we had brand new, this engine should have 130, say it's got 125. Okay, so we release the pressure, we screw it into the next spark plug hole, have it crank the engine again 8, 9 times and see what the reading is. Okay, we've got maybe 128, maybe 130 possible, depends on how many miles are on the engine. Okay, everything looks good. All right, we record that number. We go down here to the third cylinder, and let's just say for discussion purposes, number 3 spark plug is a little bit oil fouled. So now when we plug into that cylinder, we're going to go, there could be something in here that isn't quite right. So we're going to crank this engine over again, look at the reading, and we go, uh-oh, we're down to 90 pounds. Okay, so the spark plug has oil deposits on it, okay, and we're down to 190 pounds. We could have some worn cylinder walls, we could have some worn piston rings, could be worn valve seals, but it would have to be a loose, a worn valve, also intake valve. So right away I would think that we've got 90 pounds here. I'm thinking I've got some worn cylinder piston rings in that cylinder. You record that, you mark it down, you remember what the plug had, you remember what the reading was. We got on to number 4 cylinder, crank it over, okay, we're back up to 125, looks good, okay. Again, corresponding spark plugs look pretty good. Pull it out, we go down, and say the rest of our readings are all within range. If we're down below 100, if we're down 90 on all the cylinders, we know we've got some valves leaking possibly, they're not seating properly. We might have some piston rings worn, we might have some cylinder walls worn. If you have nothing, could have a big hole in the piston. You know, you just never know, but you would have had a miss in the engine should you try to drive it. So the compression test is what you need to do to determine what this engine is like inside. If all these are good, if the manufacturer said you should have 130 pounds compression, you've got 125 to 130, 128, even 120. Okay, the car's got 60,000 miles on it, it's got some wear. That's good. They're all even, everything's working fine, everything's great. So, but here we have this number 3 cylinder. I said before, we have this number 3 cylinder that has very, very low compression. We've got a spark plug here that is kind of oil fouled. We got to check that. Why is that happening? We can do that. You don't have to turn a wrench to this engine to do that. We can find out very, very easily. One thing I do want to mention, say we had one of these plugs here that had a lot of carbon on it and it had a low cylinder reading. It could be that just the intake valve is carboned up and it's not seating properly. And that's all it could be. And a little bit of, they have what they call top engine cleaner, which is actually a solvent that you pour down the carburetor, let it set for a half an hour, start the car up, and it will actually soften that carbon up. You don't have to take the engine apart. You can actually fix it, believe it or not, with an additive, with a chemical. So again, you would look at that carbureted cars from the old days, running rich. You will get a lot of carbon deposits on the valve stem and on the upper side of the valve. It could build up to the point where it won't let the valve seat properly. Okay, so we got number 3 cylinder here. Number 3 cylinder has got low compression. We assume we may have some oil leakage or some ring problems. So what we are going to do is we're going to take a fitting, and I don't have one here, but you can make a fitting out of an old spark plug. You can buy them, and basically what they are is another fitting just like this fitting on the end of this compression gauge. You're going to screw it into that cylinder, but And what you're going to do then is we're going to take shop air with an air hose. We're going to bring that cylinder up on top dead center, and we're going to fill that cylinder with air. So now we have this, the piston's up on top, we have the small area of the combustion chamber, and we've put maybe 120 pounds of air compressor shop air into that cylinder. And then we're going to get our eyes and ears going. So we've got air in that cylinder. We know number 3 is weak. So now we've got air in the cylinder, and what are we going to do? Well, first thing, we're going to listen at the top of the carburetor. If we can hear air coming out backwards up through that carburetor, we know we've got an intake valve that is not seating properly. It could be carboned up, as I said. It could be cracked. It could be burnt, and it could be warped. It's, for whatever reason, the air is coming around that intake valve, coming up through the intake manifold, up through the carburetor, and out the top. So you listen there. Okay, we have nothing there. So air is leaking down. I mean, we've got pressure in there, but air is going somewhere. Walk around the back of the car and put your ear to the tailpipe and listen. And if you got air coming out the tailpipe, that means that compression, that air pressure, is going past the exhaust valve for the same reasons: carboned up, warped, cracked, or just plain not seating right. Usually an exhaust valve will warp quicker because they work in the heat, they work in the exhaust side, and they're going to be hotter. Almost in every instance, the exhaust valve is a little bit hotter because it's actually working in a flame when you really have this engine running at high RPM. So if you have air leaking out there, you know you got an exhaust valve that's a problem. And okay, then you're going to have to do some surgery. The head's going to have to come off. Okay, so we come back from back there. There's no air leaking out back there. What next? Okay, pull the oil cap off right here and listen. Listen into the, or if it's on the side of the engine, on the older engines, pull that cap off and listen for air coming out of the crankcase. What that tells you is the air is going down past the piston rings, down past the piston, past the ring, down into the crankcase, and now the air is actually escaping down into the oil pan, and you'll hear it coming out the oil breather. Well, no matter where it's at, it'll be coming out there. That's going to tell you that, okay, I've got maybe a hole in the piston, maybe I got a broken piston ring, maybe I got worn piston rings, maybe I got really worn cylinder walls.